Hi friends. So today I'm going to talk a bit about trans people and particularly the standards of care that came out in fall of 2022 and what that means. So bear with me, buckle in, it's going to take some time. So I should start by talking about the fact that between about 2010 and 2021, progress was made, particularly in the US, around trans rights, or human rights as I call them. 15 states and the District of Columbia protect gender identity and expression in the US. And in Canada, that was done federally because it was taking place province by province. And so the federal Liberals passed a law. And so that pertains to all of Canada. However, more recently, 2022 in particular, it seemed like both in the US and Canada, there was a backlash around more visibility of trans people, particularly around things like drag brunches or drag queen story time at libraries, which had been happening in Calgary in particular for at least, I want to say at least four-ish years. But it seemed like 2022, people all of a sudden noticed them and got angry. Arguably, that might have been around increased visibility and acceptance, you know, kind of like RuPaul's Drag Race, popularizing and mainstreaming drag, for example, upsets some people who don't understand that sexuality is one thing, gender is another thing, and sex is another thing, as we talked about way at the beginning of class. So anti-trans backlash is happening here in Calgary. There have been protests at drag queen reading at library to kids events, which are just drag queens reading kids' books. It's charming and delightful. And there was also a misleading story supposedly about a trans woman at a pool that was proven by, once the Calgary police investigated, it was proven to be false. So I'm going to put all this material up on the D2L page. So that's kind of the context. That's what's happening politically around trans inclusion or exclusion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, particularly since we're talking about medical and scientific gatekeeping around trans people, I'm going to talk specifically about the standards of care. And I'm going to be referring to some work produced by Dr. A.J. Eckert, who's works in Connecticut and serves as the medical director of Gender and Life Affirming Medicine program there, and Dr. Quinnicut McLemore, who's a social psychology PhD, and Dr. Tay Meadow, who's a professor of sociology at Columbia University, who wrote a book called Trans Kids Being Gendered in the 21st Century. So I'm referring to material by people who are PhDs, not just stuff you read on Facebook. So I just want to remind you that trans is used as a term to encompass people whose gender identities don't align with the sex they were assigned at birth, including transgender, non-binary, gender diverse, and gender non-conforming people. So in September of 2022, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or Wpath, released its long-awaited 8th update to its standards of care, also known as SOC, for transgender and gender diverse people, again, colloquially then called the SOC8. So I'm going to talk about the standards of care 8 as the SOC8, and the World Professional Association for Transgender Health as Wpath. So Wpath is globally recognized, and it's published internationally accepted clinical guidelines for the social, medical, and surgical gender-affirming care for trans people since 1979. In their own words, quote, Wpath is committed to ensure the highest standard of care is achieved and presented in our standards of care. In practice, the SOC guidelines are, as defined by the World Health Organization, quote, recommendations intended to assist providers, that is healthcare providers, and recipients of healthcare and other stakeholders to make informed decisions. So the previous 7 editions of the standards of care have a complicated history. Editions before SOC7 were criticized by trans healthcare experts for creating unnecessary barriers to care, such as compulsory psychotherapy in SOC5. Indeed, editions before SOC7 did not identify conversion therapy for trans people as unethical, often used pathologizing language such as gender disturbed and disordered gender identities. And they were predominantly written by cisgender people, specifically cisgender men, thus overlooking many important aspects of identity and care. The SOC4, published in 1990, required mandatory genital exams on trans patients. And in Dr. Harry Benjamin's framework, to be eligible for care, quote, true transsexuals had to exhibit hatred for their genitalia. Those permitted gender-affirming surgeries were highly encouraged to assimilate into heterosexual identities and expected gender roles, and to avoid people with diverse gender identities or sexual orientations. So you had to become heterosexual and only associate with other heterosexuals. The general pattern with each version of the SOC has been to remove arbitrary assessment procedures and to divest from the idea that being trans is a form of mental illness. However, the legacy of that association is still felt in each version. Not only were prior editions developed by people demonstratively hostile to fundamental rights for trans youth and adults, but they also gate-kept care for arbitrary and dehumanizing reasons. The history of standards of care revisions has been steadily rolling back these arbitrary requirements and acknowledging conversion therapies as harmful. Though the SOC were a leap forward from other editions, trans experts such as Dr. Kelly Winters, PhD, had kept a wish list for the SOC8 edition. So broadly speaking, those wishes centered upon divorcing the SOC from dubious evidence and completing the removal of frameworks that construe simply being trans as a form of mental illness. Another wish was to contextualize and rebut the 80% desistance myth, which was an idea that arose from systematically flawed studies using outdated, unclear standards for who qualifies as trans youth, which holds that the majority of trans children will not identify as trans once they become adults. This conclusion, the 80% desistance myth, was discredited by scholarship and contradicted by recent research using modern standards. A related wish was for a more coherent and consistent working definition of gender dysphoria that does not construe the experience as simply being trans as a pathology. Removal of a requirement of a 12-month experience of living in an identity-congruent gender role, because that can be hard for people who may not be able to pass without medical intervention. And finally, more transparent, less discriminatory standards for psychiatric practice with trans people. So these wishes suggest that the ideal for the SOC8 would be to overcome the historical biases and pathologizing frameworks that led past SOC versions to fall short in the eyes of people who care about trans people. So according to a Wpath authored press release from September 15, 2022, the SOC8 result from a rigorous 5-year scientific effort by over 120 healthcare and academic professionals around the world, building on decades of research, clinical experience, and extensive literature reviews. The SOC8 are the first version to use an evidence-based approach and are 260 pages of the most comprehensive set of guidelines yet on trans health. The latest edition is the first time trans adolescents and trans children have had separate chapters devoted specifically to their care. So I have been trying to get through the 260 pages to share with you. It's a lot. So I'm working my way through it. So I'm trying to kind of boil down some things in this lecture to share with you. So we know that in the US and also in Calgary, trans children and adolescents can be the target of the conservative right, who couch their rhetoric in pseudoscience and have for years mapped out an agenda to separate trans rights from the greater LGBTQ movement to make trans people a weaker and more vulnerable target. So it's unfortunately in some ways predictable that most of the media controversy around the SOC8 centers almost exclusively around the chapters on child and adolescent care. It's even more unfortunate that it centers around these chapters specifically for doing at least a little of what trans scholars have argued in favor for many decades. Trans healthcare is not without precedent, and the model of gender-affirming care is well established. I mean, Harry Benjamin and Alfred Kinsey were talking about this in the 40s, as we talked way back, I think in module 3 about the invention of heterosexuality and homosexuality. And Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld at the turn of the 20th century was talking about these things. So this is not new. This information and thinking about these concepts of sex, gender, and sexuality and how to engage with that has been around in various versions for at least over 100 years, in fact. Those against trans healthcare set up a false dilemma. Informed consent does not mean that there are no comprehensive assessments for people who wish to undertake a social and medical transition. The Wpath endorses informed consent and the affirmative approach. Anything else contradicts the Wpath principles, depathologization, harm reduction, medical necessity, and informed consent protocols. So you can view these, I've linked it through a Prezi, if you want to have a look at the 206 pages for yourself to have a read. The Wpath SOC guidelines are, by and large, guidelines followed by gender-affirming clinics in both the US and Canada that operate on an informed consent model. And there is such a clinic here in Calgary called META, METTA, which provides care for trans folks, including children and adolescents. Deviations from the SOC are exceptions, not the rule. They are often justified if they are deviated from, such as a trans 14-year-old who had top surgery because they are significantly limited in life activities by the presence of their chest, which you might do for a 14-year-old cis girl as well if she has inconveniently, uncomfortably large breasts. Or, for example, a trans 17-year-old who might have surgery a week before they turn 18 years old. So these rare cases can't be really described as going rogue, and no one examining data could consider them common. In a data set analyzed by Reuters News, only 56 such surgeries occurred that had insurance claim amongst, this is in the US, over 100,000 adolescents diagnosed with gender dysphoria in the same 3-year period. So in the US, 56 surgeries that did not conform specifically to the SOC, but still had informed consent, 56 out of 100,000 adolescents. Healthcare centers have been targeted, physicians threatened, scandals manufactured in the media, and patients left without resources for care that is difficult to access in the first place, in the US in particular. People who have tweeted about transgender clinics caused web pages to shut down and support groups to be canceled, or performances to be canceled, or readings to be canceled, and so much for freedom of speech. So age restrictions for gender-affirming medical care for youth have always been arbitrary and unscientific. Puberty starts at different ages for different people and develops at varying paces. Despite what Elon Musk, who isn't new to composing transphobic tweets, suggests, gender-affirming medical interventions are only indicated once a trans youth shows signs of puberty. And you can look up Tanner's stage of development, which I had to do to show that there are a sequence based on Tanner of the expected sequence of puberty as you transition from childhood to adolescence. The SOC are tailored to the development of the individual patient, right? Again, so I started puberty 11 in my own case, but somebody could be 12 or 13 or 14 or whatever, right? So it's about the individual, not about arbitrarily setting that puberty starts at 13. Because for some people it starts much earlier, for some at that time, for some later. So the SOC8 are tailored to the development of the individual patient. Every patient is different and requires individualized care. Treatment should be guided by the puberty Tanner stages, not by simply chronological age. So this principle applies to gender-affirming surgery as well. Though the Wpath SOC guidelines do not recommend considering gender-affirming surgical procedures with higher risk of complication in youth under 18, surgeons may rely on the maturity of a patient instead of chronological age to determine the readiness of a patient for surgical procedure. Even then, records of minors having surgery are rare. Most of the minors are 17 years old, and procedures are not performed on young children. A 2009 review of the available research on gender-affirming surgery in trans youth noted that the reasons surgeons agreed to perform surgery on trans feminine minors included the patient having strong family support and the ability to recuperate in a safe environment, being able to, quote, fully transition before entering the workforce or university, which could be a safety issue, and future schedules that may impede post-operative outcomes. So again, weighing the individual person's situation. Boston Children's Hospital received a bomb threat after being accused on social media of giving children trans-related care. Boston Children's Hospital has an age minimum of 17 to qualify for surgery. However, no one has had a surgical procedure that young. Being 17 allows you to ask for one, not get one. So qualify means you get put onto a schedule. So a patient can schedule a surgery at 17, but can't get one until 18. So no, Boston Children's Hospital is not performing gender-affirming surgeries on children. And here's some interesting information as well. If you contrast this reaction to trans kids and adolescents to a much more common clinical situation, specifically that cisgender girls under 18 can and do undergo breast augmentation and reduction without the conservative hand-wringing over, quote, bodily mutilation that top surgery incurs, despite its noted benefits on gender congruence and chest dysphoria. Even cisgender patients experience physical and psychosocial well-being following reduction mammoplasty, that is breast reduction surgery. Studies largely conclude that the benefits of breast reduction surgery can provide adolescents outweigh the risks. Surgeries on cisgender minors are up to 24 times more common than surgeries on trans minors. It's estimated that in 2020, 3,200 cisgender girls aged 13 to 19 in the US received breast implants, and over 4,600 cisgender teenagers had breast reductions, while only 200 trans minors had top surgery. Reuters News recently ran the numbers to identify how many youth have accessed gender-affirming medical and surgical care. They identified 256 gender-affirming top surgeries performed on trans youth aged 13 to 17 in 2020. In 3 years, from 2019 to 2021, there are only 56 genital surgeries amongst patients 13 to 17 with a gender dysphoria diagnosis. To get a sense of these numbers, the analysis drew on public and private health insurance claims for about 330 million US patients over 5 years from 2017 to 2021. So again, there were 56 genital surgeries and 256 top surgeries or chest surgeries performed out of 330 million US patients over 5 years. This hardly means that clinicians are going rogue. The moral panic about children having gender surgeries disregards the many obstacles trans people experience and access to surgical care, and that's both in the US and Canada. It may be covered, but also how do you get access to it? There may be only one place in the province you can get it or not at all. And you may be on a giant waiting list. And so in the US, of course, where there isn't necessarily health insurance coverage, there's a lot of socioeconomic barriers, barriers to receiving health letters in support of surgery, limited surgeon availability, and the need for parental permission. So, and then insurance companies in the US will often not even approve any gender-affirming surgeries on minors. Trans youth depend on their families for medical decision-making. Given that youth often need both parents' permission to make legal or medical changes, this can create the need for a holistic approach that educates and supports all family members. I'm getting close to the end, but it's going to go over 20, sorry. The SOC8 are vague about how harmful parental guardian involvement is determined, In practice, the courts often place a high burden on showing that medical treatment that parents object to is necessary. And that's happened both in the US and Canada. There was a recent BC case, for example, of one parent being okay with the kid's transition and the other parent not. And so it went to the courts. The state is more likely to interfere if it's established that a child's life is imminently endangered. The harm principle contends that state intervention is justified if parental refusal puts their child at significant risk of preventable harm. Another long-used threshold, that is the best interest standard, argues that state intervention is warranted if a parent acts in contrary to a child's best interest. What is absent from the SOC8 commentary on re- or detransitioners is actual guidance or recommendations for care of this patient population, as those who may have stopped hormones for various reasons found re- or detransition mentally and physically challenging and often avoid healthcare providers due to this stigma. So there are a percentage of people who either detransition or detransition and then retransition, but there's not great guidance on how to help those folks. Retransition happens infrequently and should be facilitated in a gender-affirming framework as smoothly as possible, particularly for youth. The latest attempt at couching conversion therapy in a palatable language is called gender exploratory therapy. There is a difference between gender exploration and disaffirmation. Ongoing gender exploration is a natural process for all youth, should be supported, and should not be a barrier to accessing gender-affirming medical care. The SOC8 encourage healthy gender exploration while noting that attempts to force gender exploration onto a patient are ill-advised and unwelcome. Not all gender-diverse youth want to explore their gender. In 2017, Dr. Richard Green published a legal strategy to circumvent laws and health policies prohibiting gender conversion psychotherapies by simply labeling such practices as gender identity exploration or development. To the opposition, the disapproval of pushing gender-diverse children into making sure they're confident they're not cisgender is equivalent to pushing cisgender children into being trans. The SOC8 should have been firmer on their stance here. Conversion therapy increases psychological distress and suicide attempts and should be banned, plain and simple, which it is, particularly around sexuality in many places in the US and Canada. That is no conversion therapy for homosexually categorized people. The same should be for trans people. Affirming interventions improve mental health, promote well-being, and mitigate anti-trans stigma. Additionally, it would have been helpful for the SOC8 to include a discussion of the dangers of disaffirming therapy, including gender exploratory therapy. Statement 7.5 in the SOC condemns any efforts to discourage a child's gender-diverse expressions or identity. Those in the trans health field practice gender-affirming informed consent care in the framework of science-based medicine, as bolstered by the Wpath SOC8. Are the Wpath SOC8 perfect? No, they are not. Are they intended to be rigid, immovable, and followed without question? That would be unscientific. The SOC8 are best or promising practices meant to evolve as science evolves and new research develops and adapts to individual clinical situations. We are learning more about gender all the time, so these should not be frozen in time. Overall, the SOC8 guidelines are a step in the right direction. They endorse informed consent, gender-affirming care for gender incongruence, which is notable as not every trans person experiences gender dysphoria, and dispense with arbitrary gatekeeping such as age-based guidelines. The SOC8 edition is at its most robust when it sets out why it has flexible guidelines for care. What critics explicitly object to in the SOC8 is that this latest edition doesn't advance efforts to gatekeep care. That is because regardless of the claims otherwise, those opposed to trans care aim to vilify trans people, delegitimize trans medicine, and put a full stop to any provision of gender-affirming healthcare, not to improve gender-affirming care based on science. Whew, okay, we're rounding in on 25 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. We're going to talk a lot about this in class, and hopefully this information was helpful to you in terms of summarizing some of that information that we're going to talk about in class. All right, as I always say, take care, stay safe. Thanks for sticking with me for almost 25 minutes. Goodbye.